Welcome to Mastering the Attention Economy podcast. I'm your host, Ari Lewis. Once a week, we interview communication professionals on how they earn attention for their brands using social content and PR. Today's guest is Jasmine Bina. Jasmine is a brand strategist and CEO of Concept Bureau, a brand strategy firm.
Yeah, happy to.
So I'm really glad that you're on the podcast. You're introduced through a previous guest, Anna, who spoke highly about you. And I think it would just be good to, start off, talk about, you were in PR and then you ended up starting an agency, talking about the work you do there and sort of your background.
Yeah, sure. So, our agency today is Concept Bureau. It's a brand strategy agency, and we started it about 10 years ago, and it was originally a PR agency. So we kind of cut our teeth working with a lot of tech clients. And 10 years ago, tech clients, it was like the app economy was booming, valuations were crazy, money was flowing really easily. So we would get a lot of these big companies that had kind of just blown up overnight and didn't really understand how or why they had blown up. They didn't understand like what the levers were to their business yet. That was when you could get that big so fast and not really know why. So they would come to us and they were like, hey, we're ready to go to press. And I couldn't really take them to press because I didn't know what the brand was. So we were doing more and more like brand work, even though I wasn't even calling it brand work at the time. We were trying to like reverse engineer what the PR story would be into the actual DNA of the brand itself. What's the narrative? What is the transformation they're trying to create among their users? What's their perspective and point of view about the future of their space? All the things that make a brand that also feed really well into PR. And we ended up doing more and more of that. And I realized, okay, the real value that we're delivering is actually helping people position their company so that they're defensible, so that they can create like a moat around the company, which at the time you could do with like, network effects or actual product features. That's less and less possible nowadays. So a lot of your defensibility comes from like the storytelling and the loyalties that you create. So about 4 or 5 years ago, we pivoted. My partner, who's also my husband, joined as well. He comes from an engineering background, so he completely overlaid a lot of systems and processes and frameworks over what we do. When I started doing PR and brand strategy, it was very like intuitive. I felt it was creative. I was like, there's no way you can put a process around this. Like, storytelling can't be constrained. I was so wrong about that. And so then we became Concept Bureau and we became, focused on brand strategy. And at that time I started publishing my writing because I had never packaged brand strategy before. I had never sold it before. I didn't know what my own philosophies about brand strategy were or what our unique approach was. So I just started writing. And then we gained an audience and then it kind of took off from there. So the brand strategy work that we do right now is very, very heavily research-based. We work with companies, in all industries, all verticals. I would say, though, that the bulk of my research over the last 10 years has been on the millennial audience, or I guess you could say post-boomer. So, people like 40, 45 and younger. Yeah, that's kind of the work that we've done. We work with a lot of platform brands, a lot of consumer brands, but also B2B, a lot of product brands, D2C stuff, things like that. So over the years, we've kind of developed a philosophy and like a body of work. And I would say, now our slant is leaning more cultural. We're finding that really, you can start your brand strategy with saying like, okay, what do I want to create in the world? A lot of, agencies will be like, what's your vision? But we don't really start there. We start with saying, where is culture headed in the next 3 to 5 years? What do we think the market could handle or is willing to bear in terms of like a new story or a new direction or new truths around a product or a behavior? What are the behaviors that you're trying to change and where are the emotional triggers in your users? There's psychographics, and basically trying to understand where is the market opportunity for creating a brand that will allow you to set the rules for the marketplace instead of having to follow whoever the incumbent is. So, that means we don't work with everybody. We try to work with brands that are trying to push the needle culturally a little bit. Like if they were successful, culture would change, even if it's incremental. And it can be profound, like, cultural change around ideals or belief systems, but it can also be really practical. It could be cultural change on like what the norms are, or what people are allowed to do with whatever, like education or self-care. So that's it kind of runs that gamut, and that's kind of the nature of the work that we do. And like I said, it's been about 10 years, but a lot of storytelling is in our work because I think of our PR background.
Yeah, and I like that point about storytelling and sort of acting as a differentiation. And one of the things I know we wanted to talk about today was the article you wrote on rituals and habits. And one of the I think interesting points you mentioned in it, you talked about Peloton. And Peloton's a great example of storytelling in that, there's so many different ways to work out, right? You can literally just buy a stationary bicycle. Well, people are, and I have one, you can't see it now, but I have a Peloton, and
I've seen it in your previous interviews.
oh yeah, it used to be in the previous videos, and then my sister, shout out to Courtney who produces this, told me I had to switch the background. But yeah, can you talk about let's start with the Peloton first as an example of like brands like that. How do you think about, you have two identical products when you're working with companies, a company like Peloton, what would you be talking to someone who's like, oh, I want to replicate something like Peloton? How do I create those, auras around the brand that makes it so differentiated, so it's not just another stationary bike?
Yeah. Well, I would probably start by gently guiding them to not try to build a strategy like Peloton. So, you know, uh, you can build a strong brand around an identical product, but it is when we do brand strategies, we find they often change product development. So when people see like the opportunity for positioning yourself in the landscape, it usually starts to inform the product that you actually create. And that's happened over and over again. And that's when you're doing real brand strategy, when you let it affect all parts of the business, because then your business is consistently acting strategically. Every action that you take communicates to your audience what your brand is about. And if you want to replicate something like Peloton, you have to do that because people watch brands, right? They don't take their brand signals just by what's on the website or the packaging. They watch the decisions that you make, like, the founder of CrossFit, who I think, I don't know if it was CrossFit or SoulCycle, but one of their investors, I think it was SoulCycle, one of their investors was like a Trump campaign supporter. There's this huge group that decided to defect. Consumers, I wouldn't even call it like them being activists. It's not even about that. They just are paying attention and they come to understand what your brand is about by all the seemingly unbranded decisions that you make. So the thing about Peloton is that, so many people have written about this. I think Scott Galloway has written about them extensively in a really, really smart way. But one point to keep in mind is that they had ritualized their product. So it wasn't about, getting fit on the bike or, the features, although its features are great. Some people would argue there are better options, or for the price difference, there are superior options. But they had created these tribes and cults around the experience of following your favorite instructor, listening to your favorite playlist, being in that virtual room with other people, high-fiving each other. It was a very ritualized experience. But you look at something like Bowflex. I don't know if they have a bike, but like they were the original, in-home, like TV commercial, like gym equipment. And for their time, they were also it was like elite to have it. It meant something. It was a signal of your identity, but they never ritualized the product. It was really about the habit of working out every day. And I think, that's what's really come up, especially with the pandemic, is that people are starting to realize there are products that are rituals and products that are habits. So let's break it down a little bit. Like, what is a ritual, right? A ritual is something that does a few things. And I only started thinking about it like this for two reasons. One, there was Anna Angelic, our mutual friend who you had on your podcast recently. She had written an article about how uh, something like 70 or 80% of people who had cruises booked for 2020 chose not to cancel their cruises, but instead took a credit for a cruise in 2021. And that was like in the early days of the pandemic where there was like serious fear and hysteria because there was so little information. And I thought that, and that fact like just arrested me. I was like, why is that happening? Two, I had also done a podcast. So we have a podcast, and I had done an interview with Sasha Sagan. She's the author of For Small Creatures Such as We, which is an incredible book. And she kind of explores the value and construction of human rituals outside of religion. Why do we create them? What's the value in them? How can we create them when, maybe we feel like institutions like religion are falling apart? So those two things made me think like, okay, there's something happening here, because the brands that are surviving COVID are very different than the brands that aren't surviving COVID. And Peloton was one of them. They were surviving. I was seeing Peloton delivery trucks show up in my neighborhood almost every week. And like, I kind of was looking at my neighbors like they have no business dropping like $2,500 on a bike. And, there are a lot of cheaper options for like home gym equipment. And it occurred to me that the same thing that was happening with Peloton was the same thing that was happening with these cruise ships, in that people weren't buying the product, they were buying the ritual. And what rituals do, which is what Sasha Sagan had kind of talked about in her book, is they do a few things. One, strong rituals help you mark the passage of time. So if you think of like, bar mitzvahs or cruises, for some people, that's an annual thing. For some people, that cruise is a way of marking a year of hard work. And they weren't willing to give that up. Another thing that rituals do is they help you appreciate change. So, this doesn't apply to all examples, but like the bar mitzvah example, like it's a ritual of like appreciating the fact that you have changed as a person, a bar or a bat mitzvah. Another big thing that rituals do is they give us stability and meaning in a time of uncertainty. So, we tend to cling to our rituals when we're losing certainty in other areas of our lives. An example of this is in LA. We noticed like all of these porch pop-up birthdays started showing up during COVID. People were not willing to give up birthdays. They weren't willing to do them on Zoom. So, there was like this in LA, there's always like, a group of people who are going to make like a cottage industry out of something. And so you would see like these front porches with like incredible balloon arrangements, a DJ playing music outside with like a face mask, and like 4-year-olds in the street, and that, when you ritualize your product, like cruise ships or Peloton or other companies have done, that's a brand. That's creating an emotional connection with your company that causes people to spend stupid amounts of money or take stupid health risks because the ritual gives them so much emotional meaning and context. On the other hand, you have products that are habits. So like, buying detergent or like any other fitness equipment, like buying dumbbells or buying a Bowflex. I know it's an awful example, but I think they're still in business. Buying these things, it's really about the habit of, habits do one thing really well. They help ease the friction and cognitive effort that it takes to make decisions. You just keep doing the same thing over and over again because it's easy. And most products are positioned as habits. They're supposed to be easy to consume, easy to order, easy to use and figure out, easy to kind of compare features to features. And those kinds of products, can still work well during a time of normalcy, but in a pandemic, it doesn't really work anymore. And this really came to light because remember when the pandemic first started, supply chains were disrupted everywhere. So you couldn't even get the products. You couldn't get the things that you would normally get, right? I couldn't even buy like my children's clothing from the retailers I would normally buy from. And I think Perksy had put out this amazing report about how millennials, something like some crazy number, like, I don't know, 70% of them had tried new brands during this time. But even more insane was 47% said that they were going to stay with those new brands after the pandemic. And it's because when you develop habits around a product, those habits are easy to break and they're easy to make those habits again somewhere else. And, just kind of begs the question that we've been putting forward to a lot of our clients that, any brand leader needs to think about. Is your brand a habit or a ritual? And I was thinking of like examples of this recently. There are examples, not to keep monologuing about this, but I'll offer one more example because I feel like those are the obvious ones. But like, look at Marie Kondo, for example. She's really just selling not even a product. I know she has products, but really originally her content was about organization, getting rid of clutter, the peace of mind of like having a clean house, whatever. But there's this really clever device in her shows where she invites people, if they can't decide what to keep or what to throw away, where she says, okay, have you seen this show?
I haven't seen the show, but I know who she is because my mom is a big organizer. She actually is an organizer for a living.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, I'm very familiar with her. It's funny that you bring her up because a lot of people, and I think this came up on the podcast too, there was like this hypocrisy about her, about she's like, her whole thing's about minimalism, and now she's like doing all this stuff that's like going away from her minimalism stuff. So that's also interesting that you bring her up, and I think even her with her branding, there's some backlash around like who she is and her identity and positioning.
Yeah, I told you people are listening. So anyways, she has this ritual, and I'm sure you know this, where you take an object, if you can't decide what to do with it, you hold it to your chest, you meditate on it, and you ask yourself, does this spark joy? And then you decide. And now you're not making a decision logically, you're making a decision very intuitively and emotionally. And it's a really clever device because it ritualizes what you keep versus what you throw away. It forces you to ask yourself, have I changed since I bought this product the first time? It sanctifies what that product means to you. And I think that's why her brand, it worked during the time that it came out, and it's sparked like a whole wave of organization shows that just keep getting served up in my Netflix queue because there was this ritualistic piece that people could really attach themselves to. And I think that's why the books took off too. Or the book, I don't know how many books she's written. But you see, it kind of shows up everywhere if you look for it.
So, as you talk about like this ritual and these habits, in your article, you talked a lot about like positioning and the emotional aspects of things. Do you also think about the psychology of things? One of the recurring themes that we've had with a few of the guests is we had a guest named Rob Henderson on who does human psychology stuff. And he talks a lot about tribalism, but we've also had guests talk about like this gamification aspect with like these rituals and habits of, if you think about when you do the Peloton ride, it's like, hey, get your 7-day streak. Do you think the habits and these rituals are built using the gamification, or do you think it's more the storytelling and the positioning, or it's a combination of the two? And how do you, integrate that psychological part of things of like, and I just used the Peloton as an example, but maybe you could talk about with your clients, like adding, those gamification habits.
So it's a really good question. Gamification makes me think of, or habit building makes me think of like Nir Eyal and his book about forming habits. And really that is about tapping into like the subconscious of why habits are formed. Habits come from like a very primal place of having to preserve energy, preserve time, preserve thinking, living life efficiently. So gamification, I think, really works like on the product level. You can put it on the brand level, but I don't think that's a long-term strategy. Like brands that are about like if that's your brand, if it's about gamifying, forming a habit, the minute somebody creates a brand that leapfrogs that, and it's more about like triggering a part of your identity or promising a transformation in your life or helping you, signal to the world who you are or offering you a tribe to belong to, you lose. You lose to brands like that in the long term. So there's a place for it, as long as I think it kind of trickles down from what the brand is supposed to be about. There's a quote that I always reference by Donald Kahn, and he's a neurologist, and he says, the essential difference between emotion and reason is that emotion leads to action while reason leads to conclusions. So, ask yourself, what plane are you working on? Is it the logical plane or the emotional plane? And I would say habits, like subconscious habits, are somewhere in between. It depends on the habit or the gamification that you're creating. But like, gamification is all about like those nonstop dopamine hits where like people, it's, but like, I don't know if this is where your question was going, but you have to be careful. Like people have really like started to take back their agency in situations like that. We're paying attention to the brands or the products that kind of like hijack our attention or gamify what we do. So I really see it's increasingly becoming a tactic and more of an expression of a strategy instead of the strategy itself.
Yeah, and I think I actually talked about this with Anna, how like Nir Ayal's book is getting backlash, and it's interesting that you talk about that like subtle difference because I don't think people realize that like Peloton is trying to gamify your ability to work out, and they're trying to position it more as a brand. When I do think there is that gamification aspect to it. But can you talk about at a more practical level, like an example of you working with a client where you've helped them create this ritual process at a brand level?
I mean, not in too much detail. I don't want to like give too much away, but like, we work with a lot of consumer brands and sometimes beauty brands. And beauty kind of took off, or at least skincare took off during the pandemic because there was already an underlying ritual there, taking care of your skin. Because we weren't wearing makeup anymore, but you did want to like take care of yourself because we all kind of felt, I think, emotionally unhealthy during the time. So we were like reaching for things that were like therapeutic in whatever way. But then like, there are so many beauty brands out there. They just like, they never, ever stop. And, we realized that for some of our client brands, you can ritualize around like the daily routine, but you can also ritualize around like life moments. There are moments like that every woman goes through like annually in their lives or through certain like milestones, and creating like stories and content and products around like those moments. I know this sounds abstract, but like you can find ways to ritualize that aren't just about like time of day or holiday. You can create rituals. I know that it wasn't like the most effective, but it still like did something. Like Open Spaces, who was another guest on our podcast too, Emmett Shine, the founder, he it's just another home organization company, but they started this like regular rotation of like asking people to create mixtapes about their lives. And then they would offer it to their audience to listen to while they did their spring cleaning. And that kind of ritualized it a little bit. It wasn't just about music discovery, but it was about making cleaning like a holier thing than it actually was. Another brand that I talk about in the article was Dame Products. So they're a woman's sexual wellness brand. And so they started self-care Sundays where they teach you how to physically, sometimes sexually, but not always, take care of your body and really pause on it, appreciate it. And they were all things you could do without their products. But I found myself like getting into that loop, like include things like, massages, things that you could like, do like intellectually, whatever. And they're generally a high-minded brand anyway, that is doing amazing things for the women's healthcare space. But, even little tactics like that, when you're thinking on your feet, can help people feel like, okay, there's a loop here that I can buy into that benefits me positively, that kind of gives a bit more meaning to my everyday. I think that's another way of maybe like just talking out loud. I'd have to like interrogate this more, but the difference between a gamified habit versus a ritual is a gamified habit doesn't necessarily create meaningful context in your life, but I think a ritual does, even in small ways if you look for them.
No, I appreciate that. And, as we begin to wrap things up, the question I always ask is like a lesson or one thing you do differently. So since we talked about, your article, and I'll put that in the description, can you talk about like before you actually wrote the article, what is like one thing you wish you knew differently that you would have like changed about it, or a lesson you've learned that sort of, came from writing it?
The article itself?
Yeah.
What I would have done differently, or just like a lesson?
Yeah, just so like a lot of the people that I speak to, if they're like, for example, I spoke with someone who wrote a book, and he published his book, and he talked about like something he wished he knew differently before he wrote the book, and like how he would have gone about writing the book. So we can ask it a different way of like, when you started the agency, what is one thing you would have done differently since? So how about
Yeah,
let's
only because
position it
it's
a
it's
bit.
just a little article. Like I don't know if it was anything profound. Um,
Let's shift it a bit then. Like, what is one thing when you started your agency that like you wish you knew now that you would have done to like work better with customers? We'll ask it that way instead.
well, I'll tell you. Before my partner joined, I didn't realize the power of frameworks. I didn't realize the power of like looking at um, how and why you would arrive at certain conclusions. Like, is there a way to create a path so that you consistently and reliably arrive at the right answer every time? I always thought it was a creative process, but the more I get into brand strategy, yes, solving the questions that the strategy puts forth is a creative uh, endeavor. Like that's the creative piece that comes in that's really, really hard. But you really need systems that help you understand what the problem really is. Because it's never the problem that the founder tells you, like, oh, I needed an electric toothbrush that had a new head every 4 months. So I started a subscription. It's never that. It's never like, I saw a hole in the market that, affected somebody like me. So I created the product to fix it. It usually is something much deeper on a cultural level about the way people are changing their perceptions of what norms should be, that founder is tapping into but doesn't realize. I've never met a founder who like really just had a truly two-dimensional idea. Usually they are onto something that is already happening in the subtext and in the subculture that hasn't been surfaced yet. And a lot of times the brands that do well are the ones that surface what those patterns and trends are. So, and I'll say I think Anna also has written on this. She's I fangirl on her all the time. She's an incredible thinker. But, a lot of people have written about this. She's, I think, one of the most articulate people who's written about it. But that I would have started building that scaffolding way earlier. It just would have made me better at my work.
Got it. That's a great answer, and yeah, I like the part you mentioned about frameworks because I think it's easier for the layperson to understand it. Some people think brand strategy is so abstract, and especially if you're dealing with like smaller companies, they're just like, I want to build a product. I don't care like what my visual brand strategy is and like why I chose this font or like why I'm writing these types of things. So that's a really good point. But thanks so much for coming on the podcast. And I'll post it in the description. But can you just share with folks if they want to like maybe hire you or if they want to follow you on social media, if they want to reach out, where they would contact you?
Yeah, sure. So we're at conceptbureau.com. I am on social. I think all of my handles are Triple Jazz. So TRIPLEJAS. And I publish all of my writing. If you want like an anthology of my writing, it's all on Medium under Jasmine Bina or also medium.com/Triple Jazz. We have a YouTube channel. I'm on Clubhouse pretty often. It's all there. If you find me one place, you'll find me in all the places. So yeah.
Great. Awesome. Well, thanks again so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, consider giving us 5 stars on iTunes. If you're listening to us on YouTube, consider hitting the like button and commenting on what you enjoyed. I'd really appreciate it.